Hello, and welcome to Hello, and welcome to Colloquiapedia, the short, sharp show making the complex comprehensible. Each episode, we take a popular word or phrase from the contemporary zeitgeist and attempt to understand it in a little bit more layman's terms. This week, we're talking television, a medium that has itself morphed from relatively humble technical beginnings into the multifaceted, multi-platform, multiverse medium that we're all familiar with today. Or are we? Indeed, those who are already familiar with the Colloquiapedia podcast will know that we like to kick things off with a little bit of etymology. And television is actually a compound word that derives from the ancient Greek tele, meaning far, and the Latin visio, meaning sight, televisio. You can probably, in actual fact, imagine that phrase televisio as being part of a kind of French or Spanish old school translation audio book like television, televisio, television, televisio. And that gives you, kind of an inkling as to the universal global appeal of television, even as a linguistic entity. Funnily enough, somewhat randomly, the televisio word with their ancient Greek infusion does remind me of the passage in the Odyssey when Odysseus comes across the Cyclops. In order to escape the Cyclops' pen, Odysseus tells him that his name is Utis, meaning no one. So then after he's poked his bloody eye out and run off, all the Cyclops can really do is lie there screaming like, help! No one is attacking me. No one has poked my eye out. To which his friends somewhat understandably respond, well, if no one is attacking you, then what do you need our help for? In ancient Greek, the term not can be spoken as either ou or me. And in the Odyssey, Odysseus' epithet, so, the descriptive by which we know him is constantly being introduced, is metis, meaning cunning or the cunning one. So by the time that phrase Utis has been translated and changed slightly in the syntax that the Cyclops' friends use back to him, Utis has become metis. And so the greatest literary jape of all time has been played. Now, I reference that partly obviously because this is the Colloquiapedia podcast and we love the literary jape on this show. But also that dichotomy of kind of like the informal, non-descriptive everyman versus what later in that passage comes to be known as kind of cunning or trickery or a bit mysterious, I think in a way is emblematic of our love-hate relationship with television over the years. Now, I should say actually that the way that we know the word television today, the anglicised version, was first used at the World Fair in Paris in 1907. Back then, the technology only existed in very technocratic realm, geared around the idea of moving images over telegraph or telephone wires. So it wasn't until basically the post-World War II years that television sets started getting wheeled out en masse to living rooms around the world. But I do think it is interesting that what began as this kind of great egalitarian beacon of information sharing and access to entertainment and insights that perhaps might have previously been, the preserve of the elites, now available to the masses. Quite quickly, that medium, that platform started to come under scrutiny, suspicion, criticism, even led to a lot of societal anxieties. For example, television was known as the idiot box. It got blamed for the youth no longer going outside and enjoying outdoor leisure pursuits and exercise, choosing instead to stay indoors and stare at a screen all day at night. And I could reference, for example, Jill Scott Heron's 1971 song, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." You'll not need to plug in, turn on and cop out and skip out for beer during commercials. And again, I think this gives us an insight into the way that what started off as this great beacon of knowledge sharing quite quickly morphed into something that we've all become a little bit more suspicious and a little bit more dubious of. And I actually think that today, this love-hate relationship that we've had with television over the years has really acted as a forerunner to some of the societal debates that we're having around mobile, digital, social technology. Are we spending too long staring at screens? Is the messaging and the content coming through them causing too much toxicity? Who's controlling that content? Have they got too much influence? Are we, in echo chambers? These are all really relevant, modern, contemporary debates that we're all probably rightly having and have been having about television for the preceding decades to a lesser extent. It's also fair to say, I think, that the lines between what we think of as traditional television and some of these new platforms and screens obviously now increasingly blurring. You might think, for example, of publishers really that are now broadcasters within their own right, creating video content across the web to share with their readers. Influencers now might be where we go to get our daily dose of soap opera or reality TV, seeing what they're doing on the Insta. And indeed, people will think nothing these days of binge watching a 6-part TV series, as we'd still think of them, in a single sitting, on a train, on the mobile. So all of these kind of mediums have fused, and there is a blurring of the lines now between the different types of media and how we've come to conceptualize them all within society today. So that begs the question, just what is television today? What does it mean to us in 2024? What's the word come to stand for? And indeed, is there still as much scope for staring up at the idiot box when we can't even get our faces away from our phones to look up that far in the first place? Well, who better to answer some of those questions than Pete Johnson, CEO of British Screen Forum. And I sat down with Pete at one of the forum's recent events in London, where I found out firsthand that a lot of these topics in terms of television's relevance and its blurring lines with other mediums, all of this is very much a live debate today. So, Pete, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me today. A great event that we've just been into before jumping on the pod. Normally on the Colloquiapedia podcast, I jump straight into the term and we get people to look at that first. But I think in this particular instance, it's probably important if we could just start, please, if I could get you to introduce yourself and British Screen Forum and some of the key initiatives that you undertake there, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Pete Johnson. I've been Chief Executive of British Screen Forum since 2016. The forum itself was previously called British Screen Advisory Council and has been around for some decades now. We operate as a membership organisation. We curate a membership of around 100 senior people from across film, TV, video games and social video. And we work with those members to participate in the policy debate, try and make the UK an even better place to be in the screen sectors, to help our members understand the world that they're navigating, and to bring people from different parts of the sector together to share experiences and try and find solutions to common problems. That's very much what we were doing today with publication of our Show Me the Money report on film finance in the UK.
Excellent. And I'm just going to check that I have turned both of these on. Yours is on. Cool. So actually, just briefly on that note then, could you just introduce us to that Show Us the Money report and, give us a little bit of an insight into the state of actually getting stuff made in this day and age?
Yeah, absolutely. So the plight of sort of UK domestic film has long been a concern for us as an organisation. We were actually born out of a working party that Harold Wilson put together when he was Prime Minister in the mid-70s, and the UK film industry was in a sorry state and he wanted to help, and he plucked a number of industry figures to help him work out what to do. So we've always had an interest in the plight of the domestic film industry among the other parts of the sector. Not least because it serves as a sort of, the R&D and talent development ground for the broader sector. So we did some research about 3 or 4 years ago, which established that if you look at those who are employed on key roles on big inward investment movies in the UK, that 41% of those people's career credits were in independent British film production.
Wow. Okay.
So if you take that out, what are you left with? You're left with a workforce that isn't as capable as the current workforce of servicing those inward investment films, which make up the bulk of film production in the UK at the current time. And there have been reports over many years. There was a big PACT Olsberg report in 2017, which have been tracking the challenges, the increasingly challenged position that independent British film has found itself in. A number of factors, big structural factors affecting that. Obviously, we've seen the disappearance of the DVD market. We've seen free-to-air broadcasters pretty much withdraw from buying movies for broadcast because the value of that has gone down. We've seen costs of production go up very significantly. And all of that has combined to create a bit of a perfect storm for independent film. And it has reached crisis point, and we wanted to really lay that out and explore the evidence that was sitting in some of the data that the BFI collect, because obviously the BFI certify films as British for UK tax credit purposes, both those which were made with money from outside the UK and domestically financed films. And we thought we could delve down and understand quite a lot more about what was going on if we analysed some of that data. So we received unprecedented access to that data, and we used Ben Keane, who has been a consultant and advisor to British Screen Forum for a long time, to spend actually a couple of years looking at that data. Wow. and working out what it meant for trends in finance of films in the UK, and comparing and contrasting the fortunes of the independent British domestic sector with the inward investment movies that dominate the landscape.
Yeah, that was a fascinating report, I have to say, and we are gonna cover that separately. Jumping ahead there slightly, though, come back to the term that we want to look at specifically today. And British Screen Forum absolutely encapsulates the way that our interactions and our understanding of screen and film and more traditionally television and TV has changed over time. So if we just take that word television as we've always known it, here we are now in 2024. What does the word television mean to you?
It's a really good question. I'll take you back. My previous role before this was running a regulatory body called the Authority for Television on Demand,
right,
which was operated under a designation from Ofcom and was enforcing the rules that were brought into play by the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. So talking about sort of 2010 to 2016 was when I was doing that. And those regulations applied to services which were, quote, TV-like. So on-demand services which were TV-like.
Right.
So I spent an awful lot of time during those 6 years having to decide how TV-like an on-demand service had to be to count as being a TV-like service. And it became evident to us as we were doing that the term television had certain limitations in describing the type of service that people would expect to be regulated over the long term. And I think, it's currently used, like film actually, to mean lots of different things. So there are lots of things that are described as film that will never appear in a cinema. There are lots of things that are described as television, which will perhaps never appear on a linear broadcast service.
Right.
So I think it's come to mean a type of content, a type of content that's distributed through a mass communication medium, but not necessarily as part of a linear schedule. So most, if you look at high-end television, you don't need to broadcast that for it to count as high-end television. That could just purely appear on a video-on-demand service. So I think for most people, there is still a distinction between the sort of long-form, single, standalone movie, regardless of the distribution medium. It might only be shown on television. It might only be shown on a video demand service. It might only be shown in a cinema, but people still call that film. And television encapsulates not just the sort of traditional regulated broadcast medium and the newly regulated video on demand services, but also content that is very similar to that people are consuming in a similar way and other content. And I think that the boundaries are blurring enormously. There's still a sense that television, I think, has a level of importance. Is still distinguished from perhaps more casual types of content. But the boundaries have blurred enormously, and as a sort of, as a basis for defining areas of regulation, I think it's become increasingly challenged.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that, from a content point of view, where linear TV once was a big event in a sense. Everything from, you might have a scheduled amount of soaps per week that the family sat down and watched, to a bigger event, I don't know, like an Olympics or Jubilee or whatever it might be. Is there still a place now for that kind of set date, time, place where all the family or whoever it might be gets together and watches it? Or have we lost something of that now with the on-demand side?
Well, I think those, you've only got to look at the size of the biggest audiences on broadcast television now, and they're not as big as they used to be. The news gets 2 or 3 million instead of 10 million.
Right.
But those big live events that bring people together are still massively important events, and they do bring very, very large audiences in to linear television. In fact, quite a number of the VOD services are now looking at doing more live events on VOD services. I was at RTS London yesterday, and Ted Sarandos was talking about that for Netflix, about doing more live events, because that idea of bringing people together and having a common shared experience, there is something very powerful about that. There is something very appealing about that to people. The fact that everybody's watching the Olympic 100 meters final around the world at exactly the same time. That is a moment, and that works globally. It works nationally. When there's a key moment that brings people together, then a key event, and that can be it can be a news event, it could be a sports event, but it can also be a live entertainment event. That there's a reason why things like Love Island attract big audiences on transmission as well as on catch up. It's because people want to be there together, finding out what happens at the same time. There's something about that I don't think will ever go away. And now, obviously, it's a more fragmented space nowadays. People can access content in lots of different ways. So those occasions are probably fewer than they were, but they remain very, very important. I don't think we're ever going to lose that idea of there being certain moments where we want to experience it collectively and at the same time.
Yeah, but I guess it'd be more streaming than we might think of traditional broadcasts. And does that even matter in a way?
I think it's two things there. So sort of depends what you mean by traditional broadcast. If you mean the mode of transmission, in the future, who knows what happens with digital terrestrial transmission? That's a question for new government to resolve. But whether that's necessarily going to be as part of a sort of linear schedule in the old ways, but I think there's still, despite the decline in viewing, particularly among young people, it is TV is alive. It's like TV is a long way from being dead in that sense. That linear schedule is still a key part of an awful lot of people's lives. It's still, people sit down in the evening, and yes, people will flick through Netflix, but a lot of people will just put the telly on and will still watch it. And I don't think it's clearly competing against other forms of audiovisual service in a way that it didn't before, and that's affected viewing. But there's still a lot of demand for that curated, scheduled experience.
And am I right in thinking that there's still, maybe even more just culturally and conceptually as opposed to more pragmatically on the content side, but there's still a feeling that there's a differential between film and TV, in the sense that I might think of still maybe a film as a product or a work of art in the same way that, say, a CD album might be, where it's like, right, I've got my hour and a half, 2 hours, I'm going to endeavour to keep it to that time frame. It's going to have this arc, it's going to go from A to B, it's going to tell this story within that amount of time, and that's a complete one-off, unique unit package. You think that those lines between that and the way you might approach, say, Netflix series, they're still slightly different creative art forms, as it were?
I think they are different creative art forms. The idea of having a self-contained piece of work like a film, I think there's still something powerful and unique about that and valuable about that fills a place in people's desire for entertainment or culture that is not filled through other forms. But I think, you've only got to look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Each of those films forms part of a larger whole across, dozens of different films. And I think, the extent to that is different from the sort of, the series, the box set approach. I don't know. It's an interesting discussion. I think we're moving to a place now where the focus is more on IP and what's the most appropriate way of expressing that intellectual property and exploring it and monetizing it in different ways. We've seen an awful lot of film production companies branch out into television, so they now do TV and film.
Right.
That comes through in the report that we published today. An awful lot of those, because the financials are easier to stack up for television than they are for independent film in particular. We're seeing companies launch explicitly with the intention of being format agnostic and saying we're an IP, we're a content company that develops IP, and we might develop that in print, as a video game, as a podcast, as a TV series, as a film. All of those things, depending upon the particular piece of intellectual property and where we think, it's commercially and culturally and artistically appropriate, we could exploit that in all sorts of different ways. So I think those barriers are breaking down. And I think culturally as well, I think, there's less snobbery about TV than there was perhaps when I was younger, where film was definitely seen as a sort of higher art form by a lot of people. But I think that's largely gone when you get, some of the greatest sort of dramatic works of the last sort of 30 years have been, TV series, like personal favourite, The Sopranos.
Well, I like
are you really going to say that Sopranos is an inferior cultural product to a load of any number of films that you could make? I don't think that's a viable argument anymore. So I think some of that snobbery has gone. I think sometimes it's more about, is this a story that is best told in a self-contained sort of 2 hour period or 4 hour period if you're Martin Scorsese, or is this best told across 10 hours or 10 times 3 hours over 3 series of 10 hours, and you can do different things with those, but even then, you ended up with a Sopranos film at the end of it.
Yeah, and just the way people consume it now, like binge watching, it's like you don't need to have the 2 hours cut off and then think, well, I'll just watch 30 minutes every week. You could go and do 10 hours if you wanted. I mean, just on that point of the IP now being really important, I suppose that's where someone like a Disney, being in an existing position of kind of media and entertainment power with all the stuff that they already had, they've really identified an opportunity there with the streaming market, haven't they? Particularly going after kind of Marvel and Star Wars brands, because now they've got everything from the TV series to the film to, you know, as you say, the print and digital spin-offs, right up to like the physical merchandising, the parks. So for someone like that, who's now, I think, did they overtook Netflix at one point, but I'm not sure who's the.
No, Netflix have more subscribers, yeah.
But for someone like that, you know, it's a new way of looking at it, and it's a lucrative way, right? To take the content first and then just think, how can I monetize that content in all the different ways?
Yeah, and the way in which they're choosing to monetize that content changes. You know, we had a period in which some content which would originally have been released theatrically first was used to try and drive new subscribers to video on demand services by going straight to that service. Yeah. I think that's most of those companies have pulled away from that now. If they've got an established theatrical business, they're monetizing in that medium first, largely because, you know, across the life cycle of the property, you generate more income there, and the theatrical release generates buzz around the content, which then helps. But not exclusively, and different companies follow different models. You know, Netflix release some stuff in, you know, has a limited theatrical release, and some go straight to Netflix, but they're still films.
But looking at that, the film side again, so that still has value. Two questions. That still has value, does it? The opening box office, the weeks after that, getting people to go to the physical location of a cinema and watch something on a big screen. A, is that still valuable? And B, is it true, or is it a bit of a myth that the film companies have now deliberately geared up to do more of the Marvel and more of the superhero type stuff, because those experiences for a day out in front of a big screen, those sorts of films lend themselves better to that kind of real life experience?
Well, there's a couple of things there. So firstly, yes. I mean, if you've got a popular movie, is still extremely profitable in theatres. So, you know, we still have, you know, every year a number of movies which will take in $1 billion plus in you know, international box office, and, you know, none of them cost anywhere like that. So there's a lot of money to be made on a successful movie being released in cinemas. So there's a lot of money there. That also raises the profile of your product for sale in subsequent windows. So it's a massive marketing. The fact that people are going and talking about it, it's getting reviewed, all of that builds the value of that content when it then sits in a video in your own video on demand service, or you're selling it, licensing it to other people. Because a lot of the time, people will release a film in cinemas. Then, if they have a video on demand platform, they'll put it on there exclusively. And then once it's played on there for a while, they may then license it to a third-party video on demand platform for further money, and then it will go to pay TV, to free TV. All these different windows where it could be exploited, but the theatrical window at the start is still for you know, certain types of content extremely valuable.
And just looking at the question, you know, we talked in the forum we were just in. It was all Chatham House rules, so I won't reveal anything. But this idea of like creative endeavor with commercial viability. I listened to like Rick Rubin, you know, a lot of Rick Rubin stuff recently, where he's brought a book out about creativity and so on. I mean, it must be so hard, especially when you're dealing with, you know, hundreds of millions of pounds and dollars worth of budget. You know, unlike a musician going out and saying, well, I'm just going to pick up the guitar and make what I want to make. And that's what makes the art great, as it were. You're not thinking about the audience first. You're thinking about the story you want to tell. Is it even possible to do that with film and television? Or, you know, have you got to have pre-justified with data?
Well, I think as was discussed in the forum earlier, you know, it is an act of creativity. It's an act of artistic expression. and therefore, the creator is always going to be sort of internally driven to some degree. But there are different mechanisms in different parts of the screen sectors that mean that some types of content creation are more closely connected to the ultimate audience than others. So I'll explain what I mean by that. So in television, typically, the funding will come from the person who holds the relationship with the consumer. So it'll either be, the TV broadcaster or the VOD service. Production companies will pitch ideas to them, and they will say, yeah, I think that will work for my audience. Here's the money to make it. Here's a fee to make it. That's the way that tends to work. And you may retain a certain amount of intellectual property to sell in other markets, or you may not. In film, it doesn't work like that. Cinemas, which have the same role as broadcasters in this context, don't commission movies from film production companies like broadcasters do. So ITV will commission an independent production company to make a TV program for them to show on their linear, on ITV1 or whatever. Cinemas don't do that. They don't go out and commission films. They wait for films to be made, and then they choose whether or not to show them on their screens, depending upon whether they think they will appeal to the audience that they can attract to their cinema.
Right.
So it's a very, very different model, but you have to have some balance between the creator trying to do something that they're interested in and what people want to watch, because ultimately, as you say, it's quite expensive to make a movie. It's quite expensive to make a television program. And if nobody's going to watch it, you're not going to make many of them. And one of the things that came out of the report was how few film producers go on to make a second film.
Yeah.
And how very few go on to make 3, 4, or 5 films. It's tiny. And that is because it's actually quite difficult to find the audience for that film. Now, you mentioned the scale of the movies and why have we got to this position where we've had these enormous budget movies. And that goes back to 2 different strategies that were followed probably a couple of decades ago now, in which there were 2 theories. One, which the best way to make money out of movies is to manage costs. It's just keep trimming down costs so you maximize your margin. And then there was another strategy, which was known as the blockbuster strategy, which said, no, what we're going to do is we're going to just concentrate more and more money on fewer films. So instead of making 30 films a year as a studio and spending 50 million on each, we'll make 10 films a year and spend 150 million on each. And both of those strategies were tried, and the blockbuster strategy for the big Hollywood studios emerged very much as the winner, which is why they all moved to it. And so it's bigger and bigger bets on a smaller slate of films. And that has worked very, very well to now. Now, COVID's hit. Cinemas, particularly in the UK, audiences haven't recovered to the level they were pre-COVID.
Yeah.
We're about 70%. So there is an active debate about whether that remains the ideal model, or whether there needs to be a mix of a broader range of films rather than relying on a relatively small number of very high budget films. Do we need more, smaller budget, mid-budget films to fill the gap and bring different types of audiences in, particularly on the weekends where you don't have a big film opening? And when you look at what's happened, how other countries have recovered from COVID in terms of cinema admissions, those that have done better have tended to be those who have a larger number of domestic movies, commercial domestic movies, that play in cinemas and attract those audiences. So audiences in France have recovered much better than they have in the UK, and they'll be recovering because there is a supply of commercially attractive French movies. They're not costing £100 million to make. We're in the sort of 15 to 20 million budget, which is what we struggle to make in this country. But that's what's been getting people back into cinemas in France. They still go and see the Marvel movies, but they also go and see these domestic movies. And that's created a much healthier system in terms of recovery from COVID. So I think there's a live discussion now about whether in this country cinemas have been over-reliant on a small number of very big movies, even though that was very, very successful as a strategy for a number of decades.
Because even if that just ends up being my perception, I saw this fascinating doc about Tom Cruise maybe a year ago or something, that he's one of the last movie stars in a sense. And he was also one of these people who foresaw the coming of this kind of franchise type thing. And that's why he became so involved with like Mission Impossible, and he put so much into it because he knew he'd need that kind of franchise brand to keep him in those headlines. And it's fascinating the way that it's the pendulum swung that way. But I think, I for one would be more inclined to go to the cinema if I thought I was going to see, not that I don't like the, Marvel, some of the Marvel stuff, but I was going to see a good film, that was potentially a bit more niche rather than, just this massive blockbuster.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look at sort of mass cinema audiences, they do tend to skew younger. So you're more likely to go to the cinema, before you have kids and a mortgage and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And I saw some interesting data a few years ago tracking the sort of, ups and downs of cinema audiences, and it tracks almost exactly against the size of the 15 to 25-year-old cohort at any one time. No, I don't know if that's still true. That's a few years ago, but it was very close. We know how busy our cinema is going to be in 5 years' time because we know how many people are going to be in that age group. But I think for the blockbusters still bring people out. Every year there's a big budget movie. Hopefully there are several of them which bring mass audiences out. The big question is not will those movies still work. They still work. There's still an audience for those. They're still really, really important. The question is that the problem is that the troughs in between those are now longer and deeper. So the cinemas are full sometimes, but they're also empty sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's what do you do in those times, those weeks, the off weeks when there isn't a big new blockbuster launching. And I think there is an argument there, and I think it's something that everybody in from the cinemas all the way through are alive to. It is that maybe a more varied diet. Have we trained UK consumers that going to the cinema just means going to see a £200 million blockbuster?
Yeah, exactly.
And if they think that's all it is, well, they won't come.
If that's become the product,
if that's become what cinema is. So I think there is a question about whether we need to be sort of re-educating audiences about the breadth of cinema that is available. And there's lots of discussions in the industry about that at the current time.
Yeah, it reminds me of the old Bill Kenwright model of being a theatre impresario, which was basically, he just came down to the West End, identified slots where, the Garrick or wherever it might be had like 4 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever, and he just literally would book them out on the cheap, put his plays in, and that was win-win for everyone because it kept it. How they do that in cinemas, whether they start moving towards a model of maybe streaming live sports events, or, you saw a trend at some point for kind of, even I've been to the Royal Albert Hall to watch The Matrix played with the score and stuff like that. So there's always different ways of looking at it. Coming from a media background, I've got to ask, you already alluded to a couple of terms there. Licensing and monetization. First question would be, since digital and more specifically streaming, does that completely remove the old licensing game of selling into different countries? And secondly, can I just ask from an advertising point of view, where linear TV once had these like slots in between Coronation Street and the news or whatever, it was easier to sell ads. Is it harder to sell advertising now, even when Netflix has an ad-funded model and all of that, because they know people are going to try and skip it?
So on licensing is still a very important source of revenue for owners of content. Absolutely. And we're seeing increasingly that those who were previously keeping their own content exclusive to their own service, if they have their own service, now often licensing out after the sort of first run on that to other services. So it's still, a lot of content is original, on streaming services, but a lot of it is licensed in from third parties as well for a period of time. So licensing remains very important part of the model. And then in terms of advertising, it is definitely true that sort of, there's been a decline in value of linear TV advertising, but it's still extremely important.
Yeah.
And most of the increase in ad spend has been on digital advertising, on demand services, absolutely. However, advertising on a linear TV schedule is still a very good way of hitting a mass audience and creating, common awareness of a brand, for example. So that remains, I think it remains extremely valuable. And when I talk to advertisers, they say, well, you need to do both. Yes, you want to have your targeted advertising at specific demographics that you particularly want to reach, but you also, you also need to be on linear television, creating a sense that this is a big brand, that getting it out into the national conversation, getting people aware of it. There's no substitute for that, because nothing else gives you that reach of hitting that number of people at one time.
I mean,
it's just not the same as hitting lots of people individually.
100%. I remember one of the big eye openers for me a few years ago before the lockdown. I went to again like a forum kind of event at BAFTA, and a guy, because I'll be coming from like a digital online background, thinking about clicks, cost per click, like how we can squeeze the maximum. Yeah. This guy was like, what you might call sort of loss, or being slightly outside the parameters of what might be your targeted demographic, that can end up being the most important thing. Otherwise, say you're doing a bit of SEO, for example, this guy's typing in glass of water. That's fine to get those clicks, but these are people that already know that they want your product. Yeah. So when it comes to the big B2C and outdoor and mass, that's where you're starting to appeal to those wider audiences, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So I think, it's a balance. I mean, there's clearly been a shift from linear to on-demand, to digital, however you want to describe it. But it's a shift. It's not a complete replacement.
Yeah.
It is a shift. And, there's now more competition for eyeballs, there's more competition for advertising dollars, but most brands will still want to do the linear advertising.
Yeah. And finally, always try and extract a little bit of wisdom specifically for the youth when I speak to people on the Colloquiapedia pod. If you're a young writer or producer, let's say, I know they're two relatively different, but they're operating in the same space. You're an aspiring writer or producer, someone who works behind the scenes of television or film, and you're really looking to get stuff commissioned or get a commission as a producer, that probably in a weird way, even though we've expanded the amount of projects and platforms we've got, is as hard as it's ever been. So are there any little bits of advice about how someone could just start taking pragmatic steps in the right direction to doing that?
Well, I've never been a producer, I've never been a writer, and I've never been a commissioner. So this is not a particularly informed view. Yeah. I've always been involved in regulation and sort of policy making. But I think what's clear is that, and particularly we've been going through a time where there's been a downturn in commissioning. So there's been a lot of production companies, going through a very difficult time over the past sort of 18 months, because there's been an ad downturn and all the rest of it. So it's not been a great time to be getting into that over the past 18 months. But I do expect that to get better over the next period of time. So, recovery is covering. I'm quite confident about that. I think the key thing is to, think about what the potential commissioner wants. Because at any given time, broadcasters, streamers are looking for particular things that they value, that they want to put in their schedule, and make sure that you're hitting those points. Because if nobody wants sports documentaries this year, there's no point pitching sports. But if everybody wants dramas about I don't know,
the royal family,
then maybe. But so I think about what the market wants. at this time.
That's interesting because that goes back to that thing we were saying from the creativity point of view.
Yeah.
Do you just put your sunglasses on, reenact being a member of the Beatles and go out and think what you think's cool, or do you need to think about hitting those?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you'll get somebody come up with something that nobody knew they wanted, but it's so brilliant that it gets through. But that's very rare. That's very rare. Most of the time it will be that the person who's potentially going to give you the money to make it has quite a good idea of the sorts of things that they're looking for, and they will set that out. You can look at the commissioning. They put statements out saying this is what we're looking for at the moment. They don't put those out for fun. That is what they're looking for. And if you're pitching them something completely different, you're much less likely to get a hearing than if you're pitching something they've said that they want.
Yeah, and finding that balance from A to B in between.
Yeah.
Pete Johnson, British Screen Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie.